A warm welcome to all of you. My name is Dr. Kreuzer. I'm the co-director of the Social Data Science Center here at the University of Maryland and focus in the joint program in server methodology. In that role, I think I've met many of you, and said to one of our colleagues from the Census Bureau earlier that this feels a bit like it was time to host a party. We invited all of our friends from BC to come in. So I hope that you all feel comfortable. I'm glad this is a big room, very airy. Feel free to wear masks, not wear masks, whatever is most comfortable. I will alternate between the two to encourage those that feel more comfortable with masks to keep them on. No pressure in any direction. It feels to me the setup here a bit like a wedding, and that's kind of what's supposed to be. We are trying to bring together people not just from different disciplines and different departments on campus, but also from different institutions in the DC area and beyond that care about this topic of social data science and measurement. And I'm very happy you've seen in the program we have a lot of industry partners also with us here, and I really hope that there will be a fruitful discussion coming up throughout the day. That's also the reason why we are assigned to these tables, you know, the talking happening hopefully. But before that, we have a series of speakers that can and hopefully will, or I'm sure will, inspire us with their thoughts on material, what we want to present later on. Let me start with a couple of words what the Social Data Science Center is. It was a brainchild of a visit, I guess, that I had in 2018. Well, longer story than that. For years, the University of Maryland was sort of wondering what do we do with data science and how do we best organize that. And eventually it became clear that you can't lump this all in one. There's so much of data science and so many different disciplines, but it's easy to overlook how much the social sciences can contribute and how important it is that people who really care about measurement are part of this, because while we have a lot of data streams flowing, that doesn't mean there is real measurement flowing in. And so that's what triggered our initial discussions around the center and around this initiative. And then I was very glad to get others excited too, among them Curtis Kopp, who is Vice President for Research at Meta. I'm sure he'll be here too. And he was, you know, supportive of this idea. We bounced off these ideas, elaborated them further, and thanks to Meta, we were also supported financially in a way that we could get started, and then brought in a series of other projects to this topic to the University of Maryland, connected a few folks, Kathleen Stewart, I'm not sure she's here. Kathleen and I worked the last 2 years, actually I don't know if we ever met in person, just realized. The last 2.5 years on this massive COVID trends and impact survey. Happy to chat about that later on. Another measurement challenge worldwide to get sort of an early symptom indicator. And this is an example for a project that we hope will evolve here, and I'm happy to announce this morning also that we will have now funds for a series of seed grants that are designed to spark, you know, ideas of new measurements, putting data into new formats, advancement of scholarship across disciplines, as we have, you know, dedicated ourselves to do, and ideally, you know, helping with addressing some of the societal challenges that we are talking about today. Diego, can you stand? This is the big word. Here, already standing. Diego Mendez de Oliveira, he is the chair of the seed grant committee. If you have questions, feel free to hook him up later on. we'll also send announcements and flyers to this list that Jody, who is sitting over here, can help you with that. Pointing to Jody, I do want to, before we forget this at the end of these things, say a big thank you early on already, because Jody really worked hard in organizing this event and getting SOTA started over the last 2 years, actually, in this somewhat unfortunate COVID setting that we had, funds and energy in the new center, and then we couldn't meet. So this is why we have this delayed kickoff, but I'm excited that it is happening. So thank you, Jody, for shepherding us through. Jody is, in addition to her duties at JPSM, also the executive director of the Social Data Center. I'm also delighted to welcome Wayne Lucas. You will see him later on. He's my co-director. What is unique about the Social Data Science Center is that we are combining, this is an endeavor between two colleges. The College of the School of Information Science and the College of Behavioral and Social Science. We have our associate dean here. Patricio is munching on something, so I want to stand up, Patricio, but thanks for coming. And this is pretty exciting and unusual for a university like this, unfortunately still, and we hope to break up the silence a little bit for this. All right, so enough of the preliminary words, a few housekeeping items as a reminder. We have restrooms as you exit to the right, of Forum Hall, down the hall to the right, basically directly behind the the entryway where you came in and got your name tags. I think that's all I was supposed to say at the beginning. So thank you all for coming. I look forward to this day of discussion. And we have also a recorded message from our president of the University of Maryland, Daryl Hines, who will be speaking to us now. And I'm not sure if I have to put this up or if you will be starting. Okay, great. Thank you all.
Hello, my name is Daryl Hines, and I'm the president of the University of Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the SOTA Data Center workshop on the future of measurement, surveys, and social data science research. I'm sorry I can't be there to join you in person today due to a previously scheduled retreat for our entire university leadership team. The Social Data Science Research Center, or SOTA for short, was launched in September of 2020 through a partnership with our friends at Meta, who have provided support for SOTA's research and education programs. In partnership with Facebook and Carnegie Mellon University, we are rounding the corner on SOTA's second anniversary on the collaborative research done for the COVID-19 Trend and Impact Survey. The initiative helped researchers find better ways to monitor and forecast the spread of the pandemic. SOTA led the global survey effort, collecting over 100 million responses from individuals in more than 200 countries and territories, engaging in the largest daily survey and global health monitoring system ever undertaken. In recognition of this work, the survey team received 2 awards from the American Association for Public Opinion Research, including the Policy Impact Award and the Warren J. Matofsky Innovators Award. I congratulate Frauke Kreuter and the entire team for their outstanding efforts. SOTA's work is critically important in helping understand the problems we face with a broader impact than just global health. The research-backed initiative also targets to identify disinformation, diversity, equity, inclusion, ethics and fairness, machine learning and AI, among many, many other issues. SOTA seeks to improve the human condition through social science data research. That goal is directly aligned with our University of Maryland mission to take on humanity's grand challenges and to move fearlessly forward. SOTA's contributions exemplify what a 21st century land-grant university can do to benefit society by directing our academic expertise to help solve complex problems. Today, you will hear from dynamic thinkers, from industry and academia, who will share ideas about the future of social science research. You will have a chance to explore opportunities for collaborations with fellow workshop participants. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our partners at Meta for helping to make this event possible. On behalf of the University of Maryland, thank you for joining us here in College Park. And go Terps!
Thank you, President Hines. I forgot to mention, we are recording these lectures. There are a couple of people who in the end got sick or worried or delayed and can't be here, so hence a few MD are not unusual these days, but the recordings will be available later on the website. So, enough of the intros. Excited to have here our keynote speaker, Sunshine Hillygus, who will be presenting her talk, Confronting Data Quality Challenges in Surveys and Social Data. Professor Hillygus is the director of the Duke Initiative on Survey Methodology. She's the co-director of the Polarization Lab and a professor at Duke University. She has published widely on topics of American political behavior, campaigns and elections, survey methods, public opinion, and information technology and politics. Some of you might know her books. Among others, she co-authored Making Young Voters, Converting Civic Attitudes into Civic Action, The Persuadable Voter, Wedges, Issues in Political Campaigns, and The How to Count, The Social and Political Challenges of the 2000 Census. Next one coming up. We just had another census. It would be interesting to hear that. From 2003 to 2009, she taught at Harvard, where she was the Frederick S. Danziger Associate Professor of Government and founding director of their program on survey research. So we're happy to have you here, Sunshine, as a fellow survey methodologist and social science researcher.
Thank you so much. And I believe President Hines said that the entire leadership team is at a retreat, so maybe we should have a big party. I have been with survey methodologists before and know they can throw a good one. Thank you for being here this morning. It is a delight to be here. I still feel a little bit rusty coming out of the pandemic in terms of giving talks. And the topic of data quality is an issue that I recognize I'm preaching to the choir here. And I thought that in preparation for this keynote that I was going to pull together and have some profound, coherent thoughts to say. I think I end up with a bit of a hodgepodge of observations and challenges. And so I'm going to package it as a call to action to this group as exactly the type of collaborations that are necessary to address what I think is actually one of the biggest issues facing social science and the use of big data and surveys. So, okay, it does work. So you guys are well aware, right, of how the basis of knowledge has fundamentally changed, is changing. I don't know where we are in this process because it has been going on for a while. But it is the case that the data analytics of the past, right, is the conducting surveys and using aggregate statistics from government and conducting qualitative interviews, and that has been increasingly replaced by found data, that rather than designing a data collection, that data are everywhere, it's organic rather than designed, and that coupled with changes in computing power and statistical methods has really had this march towards quantification of everything that used to be qualitative, whether text or video. And this has presented lots of interesting promises for what we can learn in terms of addressing critical challenges in the US. But you guys are also probably aware of the adage that the majority of big data projects are failures. There's lots of discussions about why that might be the case. Sometimes it's thought that we just lack enough people with the set of skills to make use of the fire hose of data coming our way, and that it's really just a matter of training. Others really point to the increased privacy concerns that come from combining data and pulling it in from different ways and the challenges that creates. And the thing that I want to talk about today is data quality, is one of the key issues that is preventing us from really using big data in a way to solve national problems as we should. And to say that we are the group that needs to work together to figure out how to address these data quality challenges so that we can solve these national issues using both old and future ways of collecting data. So many in the room, I think, have backgrounds in surveys. And as you'll hear me say, I think that survey methodologists really can be leaders and should be leaders in addressing the challenges of data quality in big data. We kind of know how to evaluate and think about big data, about data quality when thinking about surveys, right? We look to see if the sample is representative. We look to see is there measurement error. We look at non-response, right? These are all things that are common practice for survey methodologists. We have this framework, the total survey error framework, right? That gives us a perspective for identifying and sometimes addressing those different sources of error. The same is not true for all data analytics and for big data. Again, I think this is something that all of you are sympathetic to, right? This notion that, you know, we care so deeply as surveying people about data quality and thinking about data quality issues, and yet, you know, big data analytics often ignores it. And so, you know, big data doesn't mean greater insight, it doesn't mean whole data. You know, there is, you know, well-known concern. Many of the people in this room have worked on this issue. And I think that one of the key things that I find myself saying in my conversations with computer scientists is that you actually have much greater risk. Xiaoli Meng, I think, says it really nicely in terms of the big data paradox, right? That if we do not pay attention to data quality, the bigger the data, the surer we fool ourselves, right? With massive amounts of data, we have very little uncertainty in the things that we say from the standard perspective on precision. And so, you know, the intrinsic complexity and size and heterogeneity of big data means that it's often far more difficult to diagnose and address those data quality issues. And this is all things that you guys are probably well aware, right, of these kind of classic big data failures. You know, there is Amazon's needing to discontinue their recruiting algorithm after discovering systematic gender bias. They had been using training data that was from their workforce that was predominantly white males, and so it learned to ding things like women's colleges as something that their algorithm was learning from the training data that was in. There's a failed attempt at crowdsourcing disaster relief during Hurricane Sandy. They could use tweets. 20 million tweets were used to figure out where should disaster relief be sent. Of course, all of us in this room know, right, that that's not a random sample, those tweets, right? If you're the hardest hit, it turns out you're not spending your time on your phone tweeting. The elderly, the impoverished, right, are also missed from that pool. And of course, then there's the, you know, Google flu failure that is often held up as like the new example of the literary digest failure, right? That big data is not enough. That we have to think seriously about these issues of measurement and representation. So here's the challenge I want to pose to this group that's so familiar with these data quality challenges. One is that we do have to have these conversations at our tables across academia, industry, and government. Turns out that's much harder. Those of you who have done this before know that sometimes those collaborations don't go anywhere. Sometimes the lingo doesn't quite work out. Sometimes the barriers to collaboration are quite substantial. But we also need new frameworks and methods and tools for diagnosing and then accounting for data quality. And the goal here shouldn't be just classifying something as gold or 10, right? We have to learn how to extract value from imperfect data. And so we need to improve the processes. We need to improve disclosure, things that survey methodologists, right, are very old hat. But the reality is, I think that we can't get too cocky as survey methodologists, because the reality is, I think our own frameworks don't quite work for the type of surveys that we see in the environment today. So we need new frameworks, we need new methods, we need new tools, both for big data, but also for the surveys that are reality of what we are encountering in the information environment today. So when we think about, right, the total error framework, and this is just Grove's kind of classic model, don't worry about the details, but I suspect everyone in this room knows it doesn't apply, right? Like, how does this apply to the non-probability online surveys that are dominating discussions of elections and in the news? Like, what, this was based on, right, a survey process that assumed probability sampling. Like, how do we distinguish between coverage error and non-response error? Sampling error doesn't even exist. So, like, we need to, in some ways, get our own house in order, I think, so that we can be leaders for being able to better evaluate data quality in a big data world. So the TSE, the total survey error framework, that we have been using and offers this really robust way to think about data quality is something that I think that we have to reevaluate how we can apply it and use it in the surveys that we encounter in daily life. So instead of the Google Trends failure, I want to talk for a minute about one of my favorite recent examples. You guys probably have seen these headlines. Americans gargling bleach. Right? This was from Reuters, gargling with bleach. Americans misusing disinfectants for coronavirus, survey finds. New York Daily News, this is my favorite of that picture. The guy happily chugging his bleach. Americans are gargling with bleach and drinking household cleaners to prevent coronavirus, CDC report. CNN Health, a third of Americans surveyed engaged in risky cleaning behaviors during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some have even gargled with bleach. Okay, this went viral, this survey finding about Americans in their risky practices. Very rarely were the articles that were written scrutinizing the data that the CDC was using. And this might be too small to read from back there, but let me give you the gory details. Here was the question. In the past month, which of the following cleaning behaviors have you or a household member engaged in to prevent coronavirus? One of them was increased frequency of home cleaning, and more than 60% of Americans said yes, I'm cleaning more. And then the rest of them were all what were deemed high-risk practices. Lots of gargling and drinking, household cleaner, soapy water, bleach solution, inhaled the vapor of household cleaners like bleach, misted your body with bleach, used household cleaners to disinfect hands or okay, so these are all things that the people who write questions in here are like, wow, these are some weird response options. But the thing that I want to actually point out more so than just the response options is that 4% of people said that they engaged in the thing that led to that headline. 4% of Americans said that they drank or gargled bleach. 39% said something in that category. This is from a lucid, opt-in, non-probability sample from the CDC. of 502 people. Okay, so if you have your little margin of error calculator on here, if we could even, should be calculating margin of error on the sample, it is larger than that percentage that is driving all of those headlines. This is a non-probability opt-in sample that found 4% reported gargling bleach, and we had this as a storyline. There are health advisories that were put out. There were testimonies about in Congress about what Americans are doing that's risky in their use of household cleaners on the basis of a lucid survey of 502 respondents saying that they, 4% saying they gargle bleach. So there is what I find to be a delightful, I should point out these researchers are employees of Cloud Research, so they might have a conflict of interest in doing this study, so take that for what it is, but this is, I think, just a really nice example that has not gotten any headlines of, again, the state of survey research and data quality. So what they did is they decided to replicate this study. And Cloud Research apparently has some kind of inattentive, problematic respondent tool that can be used. It uses things like asking people, did you ever use the internet, right? So various little kind of quality checks. And in their replication study number 1, what they found is the vast majority of people who said that they were gargling bleach, right, were problematic respondents. Again, measurement data quality issues that we all kind of recognize and that the CDC researchers haven't really thought about. Again, these are going to be too small to read, so let me just tell you about their study number 2. They decided, okay, rather than just using that set of kind of attention checks and criteria, in study number 2, what we're going to do is actually ask people to validate, like verify that in fact they meant to have their response. So what they did is they sat a sample. This time they had 688 people. Of those, 8% said that they drank or gargled bleach. That was 55 respondents. And so they just asked those people, you indicated you drank or gargled diluted bleach solution. Did you really? And 43 of those 55 said no, not really. Now, some sort of methodologists might say, well, okay, are you kind of giving what the right answer is? But again, this was their study number 2. So then of the 12 people that were left, they asked the question, you indicated you drank or gargled bleach solution. Did you engage in this on purpose, or was it intentional? And there was just one person left who said yes, that they drank or gargled the bleach intentionally. But then they also showed that one person also claimed to be 600 pounds and 8'2". And in response to an open-ended question, just gave some garbly food. So the take-home message here is that, again, we need to grapple, I think, in our own industry, survey industry, with issues of data quality in order to be able to be leaders for those who are using big data and don't have an existing framework at all for thinking about these data quality issues. So what it all kind of comes down to, right? We can't pretend that data, whether big data or found or designed, is delivered by a data store, right? We have to take seriously this question of the data generating process and thinking through the data generating process. And many of us are kind of inherently know that, but what I want to do is just give a sense of how in this world where the TSE framework doesn't quite work when I'm reading the news and the surveys that I encounter, how I confront this question. And I don't think that this is the solution. I just want to give you what is how I approach it and what are some of the things that I think that we should have as discussions, hopefully in this room, over lots of tequila shots or something since the president's gone. Okay, so when instead of approaching surveys that I see, survey statistics that I see in the news with a TSA framework, I just often ask two questions. One, like, what are the assumptions that this researcher is making in terms of saying that this sample is representative? We don't have within the TSE framework any place to kind of account for the modeling, right? Like the purposive sampling, this combination of kind of purposive sampling that happens in addition. I mean, yes, kind of waiting at the end, but we all know, right, that the sausage making that's getting done these days is a little bit of, a little of this, a little of that, and there isn't an easy way to really talk about that. So I think that we need to figure out, how do we get survey researchers to better acknowledge and think through what the assumptions required are. I think one of the things that I think as an industry we also would be helpful for is, are there some benchmarks that can then be evaluated to see and to check? Unfortunately, right, the only benchmarks that currently exist tend to be demographic benchmarks, and we know that that's inadequate. And so one of the topics that I think is worthy of discussion is how can we work together, how can we convince government funders or industry partners to think about what are the benchmarks that we would like to see to be able to evaluate a non-probability sample beyond demographics to see if we think that it is a reasonable representation of a larger population. The second issue, and this I think is closer to the measurement topic, and so is the one that I'll spend a little bit more time on, is the response quality. So do the questions or do the measures accurately capture that construct of interest? And this is something that I think, going back to that gargling bleach example, right, is just absolutely, is a terrifying thing in the industry, right, the survey industry right now. So there's deliberate falsifications. In two recent studies that I have seen, these were not Gen Pop samples, which actually tend to make them even more susceptible to this type of falsification. One of them had 70% that were verified falsifiers in their sample. I mean, if you have an open link and it even accidentally gets posted on social media, you're just gonna get taken over. This was supposed to be a survey of Durham parents, and somebody thought they were going to be helpful, and so they posted it on their Facebook, and so they ended up with 70% of their sample that these were even with Zoom, some qualitative follow-up interviews where they still had, Venezuelan programmers that were attempting to get into their survey. Another was on the survey vendor, Bovitz. Sorry if there's any employees here. And 81% were found to be fraudulent for a survey that was intended to be people who had been members of the military, with just basic failure of questions that anybody who had been in the military would have been able to answer. So falsification is a really big issue, particularly when you're looking outside of Gen Pop samples. So there's the mischievous responding, the 8'2". I've done some work on survey trolling and happy to talk more about that if interested. And then there's the social desirable responding that is a little bit different from just trying to qualify for a survey, but nonetheless creates a specimen error that can bias our results. And then there's the inattention, right? So the satisficing, where respondents are not providing answers with very much thought. And again, in the world of surveys today, where the vast majority of the survey statistics that we see reported are coming from non-probability samples, the issue of inattention is one that we know is a massive problem. My guess is that everybody in this room who uses those type of samples has their own kind of set and criteria of data quality metrics that they're using. But we haven't yet gotten to the point of having standard practices for what it is that we should look for as reviewers on academic publications, or journalists who should have been scrutinizing those survey numbers. So some very common indicators of response quality, things like speeding and straight lining, attention checks, open-ended questions, consistency checks, survey trolling prompts. The research that I've seen, that I've done, that I've seen presented and paid for, the key thing is that no one of these things is a silver bullet, and they are themselves error-prone. And so it's one of the, I think, low-hanging fruit for ways that we can do a better job of figuring out what the best practices are. Let me spotlight for just one moment. Sorry, I was not. Let me spotlight for just one moment. From this list of speeding, straight lining, attention checks, and so on, how I think this is low-hanging fruit for research and advancement. So speeding is one, right? This should be so obvious. If somebody's speeding through a survey, then we're going to end up with lower quality data. And that's easy to say, but the question is, how fast is too fast, right? We all have different metrics. You look across the literature and you use different standards. So, sometimes people say that there's how fast you can read is a certain pace, and so anybody who's reading that has gone faster than that should be counted as speeding. Others use a statistical threshold within the data, whether it's first percentile or fifth percentile or 2 standard deviations. Sometimes they define it with respect to the entire survey, sometimes with respect to a single question, sometimes a group of questions. Right? So something that should be so straightforward to say, okay, we can just look at speeding to figure out, are people in fact paying attention to our surveys, is something that the reality is that the practices being used are quite ad hoc and oftentimes post hoc, right? They aren't specified in advance, which then raises questions about replicability and the extent to which somebody might be putting their thumb on the scale. Okay, so, and the reality is, right, is that in thinking about speeding, that the ideal survey speed varies. Professional respondents are much faster without a decline in data quality. The skills of the respondent matters, the task difficulty, the accessibility of an attitude, all of these things make it tricky to say what exactly is too fast. So the bottom line here is something that I think we kind of agree is this key indicator of quality is in fact really ripe for research and standards of practice. And so it's an imperfect measure. You can end up dropping good respondents with any one threshold that you use, and that can actually bias results even more depending on where you set that threshold. So some work I've done, but I think others have done even better work, is to start making some comparisons of these different thresholds, and only with, I think, repeated testing of this measure of data quality can we get a handle on, is there a particular threshold that is a best practice to be used. Okay, so the other reality of thinking about data quality and response quality in the survey world today is that quality is not a stable characteristic. I cite all of the time Pew's studies on bogus responding and data quality. But the reality is that one firm doesn't get a gold star and forever get a gold star. But this is entirely a dynamic process And things change. I think about how Prolific was, kind of thought to be this terrific vendor that you could get a good sample from, and then they had a TikToker post that she was making money on the side, and people's samples after that were like overwhelmed with teenage girls and couldn't be used, right? So we can't think about quality as a characteristic of a vendor, right? We have to think about it as something that we always have to be checking, and we need to have some processes and guidance on what those expectations should do. The issues also vary widely across platforms. So when you're dealing with, MTurk, where you're able to reject, somebody who doesn't pass an attention check, like those people pay attention far more than they do on platforms like Livids or Lucid, where there isn't that same, set of checks. Then, or respondent incentives. And then some vendors are doing their own checks before they give it to their clients. And that's all fine and good, except that we don't necessarily have transparency on what those checks might be, and if they're ones that we think are appropriate, or what the consequences might be in terms of themselves introducing bias. Okay, so let me jump for a minute. Assuming that those low-hanging fruit of data quality in the survey industry are challenges that are within grasp, because I think that they are, then I think it puts us in a position to be able to, I think, better lead in the data revolution for ways that we can both give guidance to those that are analyzing big data and combining data. That in some ways that the combination, I saw that will be one thing that people at this conference will be talking about, is that data linkage can be a sweet spot, right? That it can reduce survey burden, it has some measurement advantages, things like turnout, and for political scientists, right, like we look at voter files as offering a way to produce these richer data sets that improve measurement and lower cost and lower respondent burden. But, there are, again, some key challenges. We can't say that administrative records or big data are a true benchmark. Both surveys and the data that is being linked to have sources of error. We don't have methods yet for appropriately diagnosing and addressing those very different sources of error. And one of the key things that is the perspective that I find myself saying to the computer scientists is that, survey methodologists tend to think about data quality as a fitness for use, right? It's one of the reasons that we have an industry where non-publicly sample vendors sit next to, Census Bureau members, and we know that we both can make contributions to knowledge, right? Is that there's fitness for use. And if you're going to approach data quality from the standpoint of fitness for use, we have to think about use. So we have to think about what is the research question that we want to answer in combining big data and surveys. And our standards for evaluating data quality depend on that research question. And so what that says to me is that social scientists have to be in the room from the get-go, because in terms of those research questions, it's not just, right, creating the methods and doing data mining. It is, what is the social science research question that we want to answer, because that's going to determine the way that we evaluate data quality in pursuit of that question, and that's going to determine how we then diagnose and address the issues that need to be addressed. So again, it's social science in the beginning, not just as offering a perspective on data quality that we think applies. It's what are the questions that need to be answered. The other challenges of combining data, and Frank can certainly speak to this, right, that there are statutory variation and regulations that are going to govern to ask consent, and what are the new privacy issues that might be involved in linking across different sources. And access, right? This is where collaborations often become critical. Is that some of the best opportunities for knowledge gain come from combining data sources that, unless you have a friend in the Census Bureau, is not going to happen, right? Unless you have a friend in Meta, it's not going to happen. And so we have to do a better job of figuring out how researchers, not just at the top universities, not just who used to have a foot in the door in an industry or in government, are able to also participate in collaborations that provide access for data. And then the final point is, again, if one of the key takeaways that the survey industry is learning about data quality is that, the best way to deal with data quality is to not have issues in the first place, so use best practices for design. And number two is that you have to design to evaluate for data quality, right? You have to include those questions that allow you to check for data quality. You have to include the timers that allow you to check for speed, right? You have to design to be able to figure out and evaluate the quality of the data that you eventually collect. And that same is true for combining surveys and big data. You need to design your income question so that it is asked in the same way that the BLS, asks their question if that's what you're wanting to match to. So you have to think ahead in the design of your survey to think about how you might want to link the data that you've collected with existing sources of data. Okay, so let me run through a couple of examples, some that I think highlight the challenges, some that I think give me a little bit of hope for where we can go. So voter files are often held up as a political scientist, right? Like this is all the rage to use both link surveys with voter files to validate the vote, but also to use voter files in ways that inform litigation, in voting rights cases, in gerrymandering cases, and we are not the only ones. They're also being used in policymaking. So in the state of Florida, in the state of Texas, the Secretary of State's office have matched voter files with data from the DMV to identify individuals who might be non-citizens. So if that information is collected by the DMV, right, you can then look to see, this was the logic, look to see if these people who identified as non-citizens show up in the voter rolls, and then you can figure out if they violate the policy. So Texas started doing this matching, and they identified more than 100,000 people that they sent to the local authorities to start prosecution, to start checking to see if non-citizens were voting. Okay, DMV data are not fit for use for evaluating if somebody is eligible to vote. Because when you register with DMV, you're not told you have to update your citizenship status if you're naturalized, right? So you get your license at a certain age, you have to, update it for years. And so what the ACLU in their litigation, was able to eventually show is that the data were just not appropriate for this task. The voter file data, right, that they identified all these non-citizens from DMV records, but they were just all outdated, right? That these were all people who were eventually naturalized. And so what went from 100,000 people was like 11. In the end, a massive waste of resources, and a violation of these people's rights. The key point being, right, you have to think about that fit for use from the get-go. Another example that I thought I would highlight is I served on the ASA task force for data quality for the 2020 census. And our task was to try and look at various indicators within the 2020 census to evaluate the quality of the data. And what this process shared for me is how friggin' difficult this task is. So you had a group of people who had been intensely involved in the 2020 census data collection, very mired and deep in issues of data quality. So Paul Beamer was one of the people who was doing this analysis. We had cooperation of the Census Bureau, and yet at the end of more than a year of scrutinizing, we were mainly able to say that we can't really answer the question. So let me just give one example of how evaluating data quality in the census became so difficult to actually interpret. So number one, it turns out that a lot of the indicators that we looked at were not indicators directly of quality, data quality, right? They're more indicators of the process. So, how many of the address file addresses were revised? Well, that is a potential indicator, right, of quality, but it could actually be an indicator that the data are better as a result because addresses were updated. So proxy respondents, in my mind, are one of the clearest, most studied indicators of data quality. So proxy respondents are somebody who is not in the household, is telling the information about who lives in the household. So, the first step is self-complete. Those are all the blue people, and 77% of households were completed through self-reports, and we know that when people self-report through extensive, Census Bureau evaluation, we know that they provide the best quality data. Okay, so 13% answered the census form when somebody came and knocked on their door through non-response follow-up. So proxy respondents are when it's somebody who's not in the household. So you attempt to knock on the door, nobody is there, and so you might get a neighbor to answer the questions. So we know that proxy respondents are less, that we are more likely to get things like age wrong, you're more likely to miss children in the household. It also matters who the person is that's giving the proxy respondent, whether it's a postman versus, right, a neighbor and somebody who's lived in the house for a very long time. So one of the things that the task force did was they compared rates of proxy respondents in 2020 compared to 2010. Overall, there was a little bit of like a pat on the back because there was a slight reduction nationally in the number of households that were completed by proxy respondents. The problem is that's not really a feather in the cap because the actual operations changed. And because in 2020, administrative records were being used to complete census forms when they were available, you should have expected a big decline in proxy responding. And that didn't happen. And so what seemed like, okay, it's a clear metric, we can compare, the percentage of households who responded by proxy respondents, actually turns out like we don't have a baseline of comparison to know are things better or not, because they're not actually comparable. And that was the case with every single quality metric that we could essentially come up with. It's not until the post-enumeration survey, right, that you actually had some degree of actual evaluation of was there an undercount or an overcount. And the post-enumeration survey was delayed, and so there are concerns that in fact it, as a truth benchmark, also wasn't entirely. So the point is just to say that it's hard. It's hard to think about how we should evaluate data quality for big data sets, and even when you have, an entire agency and a great group of people who are thinking about these issues. Okay, so one final example that I think does give me some, degree of hope of like paths forward. So this is work of a colleague of mine, Jessica Dunn, who's a biomedical engineer at Duke, and she does work on wearables. And we started having discussions about data quality in wearables. And the thing, the fascinating thing about your, Apple Watch or, the sleep ring, and there's all kinds of different devices, is that there's so many people, funders, who think this is going to be the future of healthcare, right? That you have something like more than 1,000 million people who are thought to be using wearables this year. And so this is one of those topics where when you talk about the promise of big data, right, that wearables is one of the key things that kind of emerges. Well, the thing that, you start deep diving, how can we convert wearables into actual, health diagnoses and, making use of them to address health disparities and so on, is it turns out they're really messy, right? People take off their Apple Watch when they're, supposed to be wearing it for a study. All of the algorithms that are getting used for wearables oftentimes are not able to be replicated because the methods and the code are being used by different researchers in different places and different data sources, and because a lot of that stuff is HIPAA compliant, nobody's sharing the same data, and so it's just a mess in terms of data collection and missing data, and then there's no kind of standards for sharing or transparency. And then, of course, the clinical workers are not trained to make sense of, right, this massive stream of data. So there's this, siloed group of researchers who are doing the data analysis and developing algorithms separate from the people who are doing the one-on-ones with the actual population. So some of the work that her lab has been working on is to show the sources of those data. So it turns out that studies that use bring your own device setup, that they end up with these massive biases because, not surprisingly, right? Different demographics are able to access and have the devices already. There's variation in the accuracy of the measures. So some wearables are sensitive to skin tone. Almost all wearables are sensitive to activity levels. And so, what is viewed as like, oh, we're gonna, collect heart rate and all of these things, it actually varies in terms of the accuracy of the different settings. So what she realized is that there was this massive need to both pull together the various data code algorithms, the diagnosis of accuracy, so actually validating how good of a job are different wearables at measuring the things that want to be measured. And so she developed the digital biomarker discovery pipeline and the digital health data repository. And what these are intended to do is be a place where there are training data sets so that when new algorithms are developed, that they can be tested on data sets that are available to all the researchers, so that there's actually comparability. They have training available and code available, so that people are like starting from the same spot with the hope that there will actually improve collaborations, and it helps them to locate the clinical researchers who have a basis for understanding. It has training available for those clinical researchers so that everyone's kind of on the same page. And so thinking about this as something that, it's still in the early stages, and so we'll see how successful it ends up being. But I think is a nice example of the type of way that we have to think big picture about what can we do to overcome the barriers to dealing with data quality in big data and combined survey data sets. Okay, so let me wrap up. Some lessons that I take away from the total framework. That, again, I don't know what exactly the framework should look like today, but just that some key takeaways, even if the framework itself doesn't always apply. The best way to address data quality issues is to deal with it within the design of the data collection or the data generation, whether that's big data or survey data. We still need to design to allow for the diagnosis. That we need to scrutinize the data generating process explicitly, and that has to be part of the process for doing research. We have to consider the data that we don't have, so looking for things like selection bias and non-coverage and non-response. That we need to consider the data errors, so measurement error, duplications, data processing errors. That paradata and metadata can be helpful in that process, and so we have to pay attention to that in terms of both as indicators of data quality, but also what is getting archived with the data. And that critically at the end here, that methodological disclosure is vital. For us to be able to work together, right, we have to be able to communicate and have transparency. Okay, so let me just end by saying that, no one indicator of data quality is perfect. And so we have to start with that as recognizing that we're not looking for a silver bullet, we're looking for a set of processes, right, and best practices. Sometimes, whoops, there we go. That big data are not enough. That we need both, we need social scientists to both ask the research questions, because that's going to then determine what it is that are the data quality diagnostics that we need. That we have to weigh the effort of all of this against the gain, because I think that many in this room who may have tried big data collaborations or collaborations across industry have sometimes learned that at the end of the day, right, that maybe we should have just done a survey. And rather than doing all the analysis of, the various big data analytics, that we should just ask the question. There is a lot of promise in this blended big data and survey data, but it doesn't kind of relieve us from the responsibility of still designing for the sake of data linkage and data quality. And finally, that I just think that there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of challenges, but hopefully that we can approach it from the standpoint of there are a lot of opportunities, some low-hanging fruit, but also some opportunities for leadership in this area. So I will stop there and would welcome any questions.
Thank you, Sunshine, and thank you, Bill, for already being up there with the first question. I just want to mention to everybody in the room, I haven't lost my German citizenship in the sense that I didn't keep us on time. The next speaker is a little bit delayed, so we actually do have time for questions, so don't hold back. And we have two students that are walking around with the microphone that just hold us your name.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. So I'm one of the computer scientists. Amazing, nice agreeing with you over and over again. I'm a language guy. And one of the, I describe open-ends as the bastard stepchild of survey research. In my experience talking to people who do surveys, they hate them, because they're such a pain in the neck to analyze. And so there are lots of things that people like me do. The problem is a lot of people like me do it, right, in AI in general, without telling, as part of the output, saying how much you should trust the output that you got, right? This is not rocket science. You can do confidence estimation on an item-by-item basis and say, here is the label, or here is the response, or whatever's in the algorithm we produce, and an estimate of whether or not I'm right. It could be done, it's generally not done. My question is, this feels like a form of measurement error that is not yet being integrated into the methodology. Is there a way, so if there were a destination going, yes, if there were a way to integrate this, we could get more people doing it. So if you had, for example, sentiment analysis, which lots of people use, and they say, okay, here's the sentiment, now we're just going to add this thing in, right? But it's not fully accurate. The construct itself is questionable in a lot of ways, but leave that aside. If you had good predictions on this, on a response-by-response basis, here's how much I should trust the analysis of this piece of text. Could you use it? How would you use it?
Yes, I mean, and actually one of the things that I love about the way that computer scientists tend to approach questions, right, is like you set aside some data, right, and you're gonna build things and then you're going to evaluate. And we don't have that framework as a standard of practice in the social sciences in a way that I think we should, right? And so this question, I mean, I view it as this question of validation, right? Like, how should we be thinking about validating, and so in the case of something like sentiment analysis, I think that we need to be doing some experiments, right? We need to be designing in cases so that you have a truth benchmark, right? And then you are able to, run the sentiment analysis and do that comparison as a test. Now, of course, it is still going to be the case, right, that something that works in one area might not work in another area, and that's kind of the beauty and challenge of working with text. But the thing that I have always taken away from the total survey error framework, because we're so rarely in the position of actually having truth benchmarks, right, is that so much of the heavy lifting that we often do is actually a thought process. so that while I would love to see the randomized experiments that validates and that those validation studies are really important and valuable, I think that the thought process of justifying and explaining and testing with whatever approach that you have is actually the most important thing, right? Is that taking it seriously doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change your research design fundamentally. Taking it seriously can sometimes mean that you talk it through, right? You think through the logic and you think through, here's what I would need to see to know if I was right, and here's what I would need to see to know if I was wrong. And I don't know if that, this is one of those cases that I love it that a computer scientist is open to this conversation, right? And I often find, because in my collaborations with computer scientists, I often find that there's a little bit of a sense of you need us more than we need you. And so, finding that openness of where we can both, I think, contribute to knowledge gain, I think is key. Thanks.
Thank you for your informative and timely presentation. My name is Mansoor. I'm from Marketing Systems Group. As far as survey data quality is concerned, if you set aside fraudulent respondents, bots and fake forms and what have you, and focus on suboptimal respondents, it could be argued that poor questionnaires promote suboptimality. Long, arduous, monotonous, what do you thought?
I absolutely agree with you, and actually, I would take it one step further. So I was trying to debate what to present, and I have this paper that actually goes a little bit more directly dealing with this. And I actually think that there are some ethical issues involved in some of the polling that's being done by academics and others on issues of misinformation. So that when we ask a question, do you believe some crazy thing, right? That we are both, separate from, did you ask it in a way that's biased? Did you ask it in a way that is, bad wording or bad order? All of those things that you're kind of mentioning. But even the content itself, right, it can prompt people towards mischievous responding, right? When you ask people crazy shit, they will give you, crazy answers. And they think you're not taking me seriously, I'm not going to take you seriously. And so things that are very prominent in the news these days, like that is a headline that we see a lot, right? It's a very, clickbait headline. Americans believe crazy things. I mean, think about Pizzagate and like all of the various conspiracy theories. And I think that the polling industry, and especially academics, right, that we need to take seriously what the implications are of asking questions of fact that are false, but asking in a way that pose them as if they're an attitude. And then to think through the implications for the quality of the responses that people are going to get. And this, in some ways, goes back to the very classic research, right? Asking about the Metallic Metals Act. So I think all the survey methodologists in the room will nod their head. Is that there's this classic, finding that I don't remember which researcher it was, Gallup or somebody who asked this question, that it was about a made-up act, the Metallic Metals Act. And people still responded and gave responses. And, I like to think of, and the takeaway is like, look how stupid people are. That they respond to this question about a fake Metallic Metals Act, and yet they gave a response pretending like they had some answer. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think that asking that question was disrespectful of the respondents, and it violates this contract that you have with people that they're going to answer your questions and take seriously that you're asking them things that they should have opinions about. And now that contract in some ways has changed a bit when people are doing it for the 50 cents that they're going to get, to answer the survey. And so, maybe that viewing the surveys as a conversation, as something governed by a set of norms, isn't necessarily how all respondents think about it these days. But I do think that pollsters and survey researchers do have an obligation, both to follow the best practices in terms of design, yes, because so much of the data quality issues is really on our shoulders in terms of how we design the survey, but also to take seriously this question of should we be asking that question at all?
I'm going to, coming from politics to content panel. So I'd like to talk about non-probability panels because you identify that as a real issue, an isolated issue. I work for a panel company and I feel back in the middle of the end is really wrong. So what we've done is we've commoditized human beings. We have commoditized human beings and we pay them very little to do responses. What do you think about if somebody is going to use a non-probability sample or a non-probability panel for their sample, that they have to, that data is going to get published, that they have to actually list their sources, where that panel came from, so those become more public and there are more eyes on those organizations. And then the incentive, you talked about 50 cents. We've done lots of experiments on that graph for the proper incentive. We know how many surveys that professional respondents take, and they do actually give some pretty decent answers, but that commoditization really bothers me. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I do think that it does change the dynamic. I mean, I think the dilemma is what's the solution, right? What is the solution? I will tell you that every attempt I have seen these days to try and do fresh recruits stay off of social media has been a disaster, and because of gaming. And there was at ABOR some research on digital fingerprinting, and Qualtrics did some of it, and it didn't give me much reassurance that there are solutions that can be implemented, from like a digital kind of quality check way. So I do think that sunlight is the most important thing, right? That it is about transparency. Unfortunately, it is the case, and I can speak most clearly to academics, but I think the same is true for journalists, is that oftentimes the people doing the analysis or doing the data collection actually don't know what to even ask of the vendors. And so they don't necessarily know to ask for questions about how many surveys has this person completed in the past. And so, with the democratization of data collection that has happened through non-probability panels, that it really has changed kind of the baseline set of expectations that people have. And so one of the solutions that I see comes from thinking through incentives. And so I actually think that journal editors have a responsibility not just to have a policy that says your data should be replicable. They have a responsibility to say, here are exactly the things that you need to disclose. So one of the fraud cases that I talked about during my talk was this Bovitz survey, where it was a couple of graduate students who were trying to interview people who had been part of the military. And they naively thought that they could just, do this survey, and were shocked and surprised when 81% of the respondents were clearly fraudulent. And Bovitz was actually shocked and surprised as well, and they worked with them, and they were super reluctant to call out the vendor because the vendor had also been shocked and worried and concerned, and yet I think that sunlight is the thing that is necessary, right? The transparency at the end of the day is key. But I don't want to say, oh, we just need to do better training, because that doesn't change incentives. I think we have to think about the incentives that are there. It gets trickier when we're talking about journalism. I think that's where, there have been times when I have said that there are a number of journalists who have higher standards than the stuff that gets published in academic journals, and that is still true. And so, I do think that we just have to think through the incentives and to, obviously the Transparency Initiative A4 is an effort. I just don't know that it is necessarily solving the entire journalistic media infrastructure that is, crumbling to clickbait incentives these days.
We have to move on and pause this discussion a little bit, but I can already tell that there's lots of material for us later on to talk about how could we implement some of these systems, how could maybe vendors or software producers make this easier, automate some of it. I can see the right people sitting around here at this table. So anyway, thank you, Sunshine, very much.